Welcome, dear listener, to the Bedtime Sleepy Historian, where the past is not shouted through textbooks but whispered softly, as though by candlelight. Here, empires do not crash with noise, they crumble like sandcastles in the tide. Kings, peasants, and forgotten souls alike step quietly into our dreams. Tonight, we drift into the marble heart of Rome, where wealth glittered and chains rattled, often in the same breath. This is not the story of emperors on their thrones, but of those who stood beneath them, the men and women who were bought, sold, and lived their lives as possessions. Together, we will explore not only how much they cost in silver and gold, but what that cost truly meant for them, for their masters, and for the empire that thrived upon their labor. So settle back. Let the weight of the day fall from your shoulders. Imagine the soft flicker of a lamp against stone walls, and listen as we unravel the hidden arithmetic of human lives in ancient Rome. The square smelled of dust, sweat, and something sharper, fear. Beneath the white glare of the noon sun, rows of men, women, and children stood on wooden platforms, each no older than a carpenter's bench, each bearing a placard hung around their neck. The boards listed not names, but numbers, age, height, and the skills that marked their worth. Cook, scribe, field hand, Greek tutor. Roman citizens shuffled below, squinting and whispering, purses heavy with coins. The wealthier among them brought agents who tested teeth, pinched muscles, and tugged at hair to see whether it shone with health. Traders barked figures into the air, their voices carrying over the clamor of the crowd. The market was alive, but it was not joyous. It was a theater of transaction, where the human body became currency. A boy from Cappadocia clutched his sister's hand as the auctioneer called out his price. The girl stared blankly, lips pressed tight as though refusing to exist in this place. A burly farmer examined the boy's shoulders with an appraising grunt. He would need them strong to carry amphorae in the vineyard. Behind them, a teacher from Athens, his beard grown long, his robe tattered from travel, stood waiting his turn. His placard boasted of literacy, fluency in Homer, and the ability to teach rhetoric. Someone in a senatorial toga lingered nearby, calculating the prestige of adding a Greek tutor to his household. Coins clinked, decisions were made. A life was weighed against the price of a cloak, the expense of a horse, the annual cost of a villa's upkeep. Some fetched sums so high they rivaled the price of land. Others, too sickly or too common, were sold for less than a soldier's monthly pay. The crowd thinned as the sun began to tilt westward. Dust swirled around the emptying platforms. Yet the silence that followed was not peace, it was only the pause before tomorrow, when new ships would dock at Ostia, and more lives would be carried inland to Rome, stamped with price tags like goods in a stall. Within the atrium of a wealthy Roman villa, the true worth of a slave revealed itself not in numbers, but in silence. A man like Lucius Cornelius, senator and landowner, measured his household in people. He owned estates sprawling across Campania, but here in Rome, his villa bustled with quiet service. The doorkeeper rose before dawn, sweeping the entrance clean of dust. A girl, no more than 12, lit oil lamps to chase away the shadows. A cook bent over pots in the kitchen, coaxing flavors from garum and herbs, preparing the day's first meal. None of them spoke unless spoken to. Lucius's favorite, however, was Diodorus, a Greek slave bought not for his strength, but his mind. Diodorus had cost a sum that could have purchased 3 oxen, or paid the wages of a legionary for a decade. Why? Because he could recite Homer, teach philosophy to Lucius's sons, and compose poetry that impressed dinner guests. At feasts, when senators reclined on couches, Diodorus stood at the edge of the lamplight, ready to quote Euripides at a nod. The value of a household slave was not always in coin alone. A trusted steward, one who managed accounts and oversaw vineyards, might cost thousands of denarii, but he could return tenfold in profit. A nurse, tender and reliable, might be priceless in the eyes of a mother who entrusted her infant's life to another woman's arms. Yet to the slaves themselves, worth was a double-edged sword. To be valuable meant survival, better food, softer tasks, less chance of being discarded. But it also meant chains could never break, for their masters held them too tightly. Diodorus, with his scrolls and wisdom, sometimes caught himself staring at the horizon beyond Rome's walls. He knew his mind made him worth more than soldiers, yet it also made him a prisoner of infinite value. If you wished to purchase a slave in Rome, you did not go in secret. You went to the marketplace. There, beneath awnings of linen stretched against the sun, stood men, women, and children, displayed like livestock. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and the faint sharpness of olive oil rubbed into skin to make it shine. Merchants set up their platforms, and the slaves stood upon them, silent and watchful. Each bore a placard, a titulus, hung around the neck. It declared their age, origin, skills, and whether they had any defects. Some placards were brief. Gaul, strong arms, field laborer. Others were almost boastful. Greek, educated, plays the lyre, reads Homer, knows accounts. The placards did not speak of grief or stolen lives, only of utility, as though the human being were a tool. Prices varied as much as the faces in the crowd. A child for menial tasks might sell for a few hundred denarii, the price of a good pair of mules. A skilled artisan, say, a blacksmith from the provinces, might fetch thousands. Women trained in song or dance drew wealthy buyers, while educated Greeks were often prized above all, their knowledge considered a luxury that only Rome's elite could afford. The auctioneer's voice rang out, firm and practiced. He named a figure, paused, then raised it again. A senator's steward might lift a finger discreetly, or a wealthy matron might nod, her eyes cool as she measured the girl trembling on the stage. The hammer fell, and with it, another life was transferred, neatly, without ceremony. To the Romans, this was ordinary commerce, as natural as buying grain. But to those upon the platform, each sale was a dividing line, between one family and another, between one fate and the next. And though their price was fixed in silver, their value, in truth, lay far beyond the coin exchanged in the dust of the Forum. Beyond the marble villas and bustling markets of Rome, far from the Senate's debates and the poet's verses, stretched the estates, the latifundia. These were vast tracts of land, sometimes spanning miles, owned by the wealthy elite. Their prosperity was built not on the sweat of free citizens, but on the endless labor of slaves. The field slave was the cheapest and most numerous of all. Purchased in groups, often chained together during transport, they were valued less for skill than for endurance. Their placards had no boast of education, no mention of talents, only the blunt words: strong, young, fit for work. For the price of a good horse, a man might buy 2 or 3 such slaves, and if one perished in the heat of the fields, another could easily be replaced. At dawn, overseers roused them with shouted orders, and they marched in lines to the vineyards, olive groves, and wheat fields. Iron tools were placed in their hands, hoes, sickles, shovels, yet these were as much shackles as instruments. The sun was merciless, and overseers carried whips to drive those who faltered. Food was coarse bread, beans, and sometimes olives, just enough to keep muscles working. Shelter was rough huts, shared by many, offering no comfort but the chance to collapse at night. For such lives the cost was low, yet the toll was immense. Many did not live past their prime years, their bodies ground down by labor harsher than stone. Still, Roman society scarcely noticed. To them, these slaves were the foundation of abundance, the unseen hands that plowed, sowed, harvested, and pressed the olives that flavored a senator's table. The true cost of a field slave, then, was not in silver, but in the countless years of human life burned away beneath the Italian sun. Rome's wealth gleamed brighter because their backs bent lower, and their cries were carried off into the hills, forgotten before they reached the city walls. If the fields demanded sweat and silence, the Roman household required a different kind of servitude, one that dressed in refinement but carried its own invisible chains. Household slaves were often seen as more fortunate than those condemned to the latifundia. They served in the atriums of patrician villas, where marble floors reflected the light of oil lamps, and perfumed smoke curled upward to painted ceilings. Their duties ranged from pouring wine at banquets, to grooming their mistress's hair, to standing quietly at the door when private matters were discussed. Yet this proximity to luxury did not mean freedom. A household slave's value was measured not only in coin but in trust, for they moved among secrets. A clever servant might overhear whispers of political alliances, or a mistress's quiet complaint about her husband, or a master's clandestine meeting with a lover. For this reason, owners prized loyalty above all. Betrayal could be punished with exile to the fields, or worse. The cost of a domestic slave varied. A boy with pleasing manners might fetch a modest price, while a slave trained in music, medicine, or accounting could cost a fortune. One household might keep dozens, each trained to serve in precise ways, a cubicularius to manage the master's bedroom, a structor to arrange couches for banquets, a vestiplicus to fold and maintain garments. In the home of a wealthy senator, a visitor might never open a door himself. There would be a slave for that, too. And yet, despite their tasks being softer than field labor, household slaves lived under constant scrutiny. A spilled cup, a delay in answering, a sigh too loud, all might invite the lash. Some were branded with marks of ownership, others forced to wear collars inscribed with warnings. If found, return me to my master. Their nearness to their owners gave them both opportunity and danger. Some rose to positions of trust, even affection, becoming indispensable. Others vanished into silence, remembered only as shadows who passed through corridors at night, extinguishing lamps when their masters retired. The true cost of the household slave, then, was not only in denarii but in identity itself. They lived lives absorbed into another's comfort, their own stories erased, their worth measured in the seamlessness of their service. Among all classes of the enslaved, none bore a higher price, or a heavier contradiction, than the skilled slaves. To the Romans, a man or woman was not simply labor, but potential, a vessel that could be trained, polished, and transformed into something of immense worth. A Greek physician, for instance, might be purchased at a cost that rivaled a country estate. Medicine in Rome was often imported knowledge, and Greek slaves were seen as living repositories of wisdom. To own such a man was not merely practical, it was a statement. A senator with a household doctor could boast of refinement as well as security, for the life of his family, even of himself, might rest in those learned hands. Teachers, too, commanded extraordinary sums. Greek tutors trained in philosophy, rhetoric, and mathematics were especially prized. For the Roman elite, educating one's son was less about letters than about preparing him to command in senate or army. A gifted teacher could mold a boy into an orator who might one day sway the republic itself. Thus, a slave who could quote Homer, analyze logic, or drill in the subtleties of persuasion was treated not as a servant, but as a living investment. And then there were the artists. A sculptor capable of capturing the delicate folds of a toga in marble, or a painter skilled in fresco, or a musician whose lyre could soften the edges of a banquet. These were slaves who blurred the line between property and genius. Their creations might outlive their own names, adorning villas, temples, and tombs. Yet the art was never theirs. Every masterpiece belonged to the master. The paradox of these skilled slaves was sharp. They were more valued than many free men, yet they remained property. A philosopher-slave might instruct senators by day, then return to sleep on straw by night. A physician might save the life of his master, but never have authority over his own. Their worth, calculated in thousands of denarii, was tethered always to someone else's ledger. Occasionally, such brilliance offered a path to freedom. Some masters, impressed or grateful, granted manumission. Others allowed their gifted slaves to earn wages, a portion of which could be saved toward purchasing liberty. But even then, freedom came at a staggering cost, and the former slave often remained bound in obligation to his old master, caught in webs of gratitude and dependence. To Romans, the price of such a slave was justified. They purchased not a person, but a mind, a talent, a fragment of immortality carved into stone or etched into memory. To the slave, however, the cost was something else entirely, the loss of authorship over their own genius. If the skilled slave was measured in wisdom and craft, the entertainment slave was valued in spectacle and risk. Rome, after all, was a city that feasted on performance. Whether in the hushed glow of the theater or beneath the roar of the Colosseum, slaves supplied the drama that kept an empire distracted. Gladiators were among the strangest investments of all. To buy a trained fighter was to purchase both danger and hope. The cost of a seasoned gladiator, scarred yet still strong, could equal that of a villa on the outskirts of Rome. Trainers, called lanisti, sold their men like prized war horses, touting their victories, their scars, even their stage names. The greatest fighters were celebrities, beloved and feared, their likeness painted on walls and their names whispered like charms. Yet their lives were brutally short, and a master who purchased one gambled on how many fights might be won before death claimed him. Actors, though held in low moral regard, were expensive curiosities. A gifted mime or comic who could reduce an audience to laughter might cost more than a soldier's annual wage. Female performers, particularly dancers and singers, commanded steep prices, their allure doubled by rarity. A nobleman who filled his banquet hall with such delights was not merely entertaining his guests, he was showcasing his wealth, his sophistication, his ability to command beauty itself. Charioteers stood apart. Technically slaves, many earned fortunes that rivaled senators. Their owners purchased them like stock, wagering on their speed and daring. Victories on the track brought prize money, fame, and influence, not just for the charioteer, but for the master who held the deed to his life. Such men lived at the edge of freedom, showered with gifts from fans, yet bound to the one who had bought them. But with these performers came another kind of cost, one harder to measure in coin. An owner risked scandal if a beloved gladiator fell too quickly, or if an actor caused offense with a reckless line. Even the laughter of Rome had its price in politics and reputation. And so, the entertainment slaves of Rome were commodities of paradox, adored by crowds, yet denied their own names, priceless in the marketplace, yet expendable in the arena. Their blood, their voices, their movements were all tallied like figures in a merchant's book, as if joy itself could be owned. The Roman elite often boasted of the size of their households. The number of slaves they commanded was as much a status symbol as their estates or banquets. But behind the glitter of pride lay a quiet, constant drain, the upkeep of living property. Buying a slave was only the opening wager. Keeping them alive, useful, and obedient was the true cost. A slave required food, and though it was rarely fine fare, it had to be steady. Grain rations formed the backbone, barley for the common laborer, wheat if the master was generous. Olive oil, beans, and the occasional scraps of meat were added depending on the household's wealth. Feeding dozens, sometimes hundreds, of mouths was a calculation that weighed heavily on an estate's ledger. One frugal master might deliberately underfeed his slaves, relying on fear and necessity to keep them working, while another might fatten them slightly, believing that a well-fed laborer endured longer and obeyed more willingly. Clothing, too, was an expense. Most slaves were given a simple tunic, coarse and plain, replaced only when it rotted away. Shoes were rarer, reserved for those who needed to walk the roads or serve within sight of guests. The visible slaves, the household attendants, the cupbearers, the litter-bearers, were dressed more carefully. Their very bodies were ornaments, expected to reflect their master's dignity. Thus, a nobleman who dressed his household poorly risked whispers about his own poverty. Housing varied. In grand villas, slaves might be quartered in cramped stone rooms along the periphery, their straw mats laid side by side. In poorer homes, they slept wherever space could be stolen, by kitchens, stables, or storerooms. In the city, some slaves were even housed in cellars, chained at night to prevent escape. Each arrangement carried its own cost, whether in construction, in upkeep, or in the subtle price of unrest when bodies were too tightly pressed together. There were also medical expenses. Rome was a society that treated slaves as expendable, yet few masters wished to throw away a costly investment. A broken arm meant weeks of lost labor. A fever could spread through an entire household. Masters sometimes hired physicians, others relied on crude remedies or prayer. Still, every injury and illness was a reminder that slaves were not tools, they were fragile flesh, prone to wear and sudden loss. Finally came discipline, which was not only a matter of whips and chains but of watchfulness. Overseers were paid to keep eyes sharp, guards to ensure loyalty, tutors to teach obedience. A master who neglected discipline risked rebellion or flight. The price of vigilance was endless, invisible, yet as necessary as food itself. Thus, the ledger of slavery extended far beyond the auction block. A slave cost more each day he breathed, each night she slept under a master's roof. The expense was hidden in bread, in sandals, in the iron of shackles. And still, for the Roman elite, it was a price worth paying, for what they purchased was not just labor, but the illusion of control over the lives of others. If the financial burdens of keeping slaves gnawed at Roman households, the deeper, more corrosive cost lay elsewhere, in the realm of fear. Every Roman who owned more than a handful of slaves lived with a quiet awareness that they were outnumbered. In large estates, a single family might be surrounded by hundreds of people who owed them nothing but the lash. The Romans knew their own history too well to ignore the danger. The memory of Spartacus loomed like a shadow over the centuries. In 73 BC, he and his followers, slaves, gladiators, the desperate and dispossessed, had risen up in a rebellion so fierce it nearly toppled Rome's pride. Tens of thousands joined his banner. For 2 years, the Republic itself trembled. Though the revolt was crushed, the image of armed slaves storming across the countryside never faded. Masters told and retold the tale, sometimes in hushed tones, sometimes as a warning to their children. This is what happens when the balance of control slips. Even in quieter times, rebellion simmered close to the surface. A slave who poured wine could slip poison into the cup. A slave who tended fields could vanish into the hills and return with others at night. A slave who worked in the stables could loosen a saddle strap at a fatal moment. Trust was always conditional, fragile, and rarely complete. The constant need to guard against revolt shaped Roman households in subtle ways. Villas were designed with surveillance in mind. Slaves' quarters were placed where eyes could watch comings and goings. At night, keys turned in locks, chains were fastened, doors barred. Some masters forbade slaves to gather in groups of more than 2 or 3, fearing secret plots whispered in the dark. Others tried to temper brutality with carefully measured rewards, hoping that a little kindness might stifle rebellion before it bloomed. But the fear was not only of open revolt. There was also the insidious anxiety of dependence. The Roman elite prided themselves on mastery, Yet their daily lives were threaded through with reliance on slaves. They depended on them for food, for clean clothes, for hot water at the baths, for the carrying of letters, for the very smoothness of their days. A senator who mocked the weakness of others might find himself helpless if the slaves in his household simply chose to do nothing. This dependency created a strange relationship, contempt mixed with unease, cruelty with grudging reliance. The more slaves a Roman owned, the greater his prestige, but also the greater the danger that one day, the hands that dressed him would strangle him instead. Thus, the true cost of Roman slavery was not merely silver coins or loaves of bread. It was the weight of sleepless nights, of vigilance that never relaxed, of the knowledge that one's power rested on the thinnest of blades. The master feared his slaves even as he needed them. And the slaves, in turn, carried the unspoken knowledge that their chains were only as strong as their willingness to wear them. The Romans often boasted that theirs was a society of libertas, freedom, the sacred right of the citizen to speak, to vote, to live unshackled beneath the law. Yet this proud word rang strangely hollow in a world where the very existence of Roman comfort depended on the absence of freedom for millions. The paradox was so deep it became invisible, woven into the fabric of daily life. Owning slaves was not just a matter of convenience, it was a mark of rank. A poor farmer might work his own field with his sons, but a man with even 2 or 3 slaves could boast of belonging to a higher station. To invite guests into a home where servants hurried to bring water, wine, and roasted meat was to silently display power. In fact, the number of slaves attending a master in public was itself a form of status display, much like expensive jewelry or a senator's purple-striped toga. A retinue of slaves said, "This man's life is so abundant that others exist only to serve him." But beneath the shine of prestige lay distortions of value. For many Romans, labor became something beneath their dignity. Honest work with one's hands, so respected in earlier ages, was increasingly sneered at by elites. Why would a man of wealth till the earth or mend a roof when slaves could do it for him? Manual skill, carpentry, weaving, smithing, was often seen as the mark of servitude, even when performed with artistry. This attitude carved a gulf in Roman culture. On one side stood the citizens, free in name yet disdainful of toil. On the other stood the enslaved, whose constant labor sustained every marble column and golden feast. Over generations, this division eroded the resilience of Roman society. Citizens grew accustomed to idleness, or to professions of rhetoric and politics, while practical expertise increasingly rested in the hands of those denied freedom. Even family life was not immune. Roman fathers liked to imagine themselves as stern but noble patriarchs, ruling their households as miniature states. But in practice, their authority was propped up by slaves, nurses who raised their children, tutors who taught them letters, attendants who followed them into adulthood. The intimacy of these relationships was profound. A Roman child might learn his first words from a slave's lips, or cry in the arms of a nurse he trusted more than his mother. Yet society demanded that the child, once grown, look down upon the very person who had shaped his earliest years. Love and contempt lived side by side, separated only by the invisible wall of status. And there was another subtle cost: freedom itself lost its meaning. If to be free meant simply to not be enslaved, then the value of liberty was defined not by dignity, but by contrast with suffering. Romans could look at their own privileges only through the mirror of others' chains. This bred a culture where inequality was not questioned, but celebrated, for it was inequality that confirmed one's place in the social order. Thus, the social cost of slavery was profound. It reshaped Roman identity, hollowed their ideals, and made freedom something less than universal. The Republic and later the Empire prided themselves on their laws, their rights, their civilization, but all of it rested upon a foundation of millions whose humanity was written out of the ledger. The Romans often thought of themselves as master builders, not only of roads and aqueducts, but of governments, institutions, and laws that would outlast kingdoms. Yet at the heart of their system was a dependence so fragile, so corrosive, that it quietly gnawed at the stability of the state, slavery itself. The political cost was not obvious at first. To a senator, owning hundreds of slaves meant wealth, and wealth meant influence. Great estates, or latifundia, spread across the Italian countryside, worked by enslaved men and women captured in Rome's wars. These estates swallowed up small farms, for no free citizen could match the productivity of a landowner who paid nothing for labor. As centuries passed, a bitter pattern emerged. The rich grew richer, their estates more vast, while the small free farmers, the backbone of the Republic's army, were squeezed into ruin. This was no small matter. The Roman legions had once been filled with sturdy farmers who fought not only for pay, but for the protection of their land and families. When those farms disappeared, so too did the independence of the citizen soldier. Dispossessed men crowded into cities, especially Rome itself, where they became part of the restless urban poor. They had no land, no steady work, and little to do but wait for bread distributions and the next spectacle in the amphitheater. Politicians soon learned that such men could be swayed, not by speeches alone, but by promises of handouts, of grain, of entertainment. Thus the old republican ideal of the citizen as a free, independent participant in government gave way to something else: the citizen as client, beholden to patrons, or as a voter who sold loyalty for bread and coin. Slavery, by hollowing out the middle ranks of society, helped to turn politics into a contest of bribery and populist manipulation. And the dangers were not confined to Rome itself. Provinces too became dependent on enslaved labor, and uprisings were frequent. The revolts of enslaved people in Sicily in the 2nd century BC shook the Roman state so badly that whole armies had to be dispatched to crush them. Then came the greatest of them all, the rebellion led by Spartacus, a gladiator who, with tens of thousands of fellow slaves, turned Italy itself into a battlefield. The Senate trembled. What if the enslaved masses, far more numerous than their masters, realized their collective strength? What if the economy itself, reliant on conquest to supply fresh labor, ever faltered? The dependence was dangerous, like living atop a mountain of kindling with a torch in hand. Thus, the political cost of slavery was not simply unrest, but fragility. The system appeared mighty, but it was brittle. It bred inequality, made the Republic vulnerable to demagogues, and forced the state to constantly suppress the very laborers upon whom it depended. In chasing wealth through conquest and servitude, Rome built a machine that could not easily be stopped, nor easily sustained. It is one thing to tally the financial ledgers of slavery, how many denarii a slave might cost, or how many sesterces his work could produce. But another cost runs deeper, harder to measure, yet far more enduring: the psychological weight carried by both enslaved and free in such a system. For the enslaved, life was not simply toil, but the constant erosion of identity. A man taken from Gaul might once have been a warrior, a father, a respected elder. In Rome, he was reduced to a possession, stripped of his name, called only by what his master found convenient. Imagine hearing yourself addressed not as a man, but as a tool, as though your entire being were equivalent to a hammer or plow. Over years, such treatment reshaped not only how others saw you, but how you saw yourself. Some resisted. Some clung fiercely to their old traditions, whispering songs of their homeland in kitchens and fields, passing down scraps of memory like contraband. But others sank into resignation, their sense of self withering under the relentless message that they were not people, only property. And what of the Romans themselves? The free citizens who benefited from this system also bore a psychological burden, though they rarely named it. To live surrounded by slaves meant living surrounded by fear. Masters feared rebellion, theft, poison slipped into wine, daggers in the night. Every act of cruelty was a reminder that loyalty was bought by force, not given freely. Even kindness from a master could be tinged with unease. Did the servant smile out of gratitude, or only because he had no choice? Children of Roman households grew up watching human beings treated as furniture, beaten for mistakes, bought and sold without thought. What did this teach them about dignity, about compassion, about justice? A society that normalized slavery also normalized a hierarchy of worth, a belief that some lives mattered less. The Romans prided themselves on liberty, yet their liberty was always defined in contrast to someone else's chains. The philosopher Seneca, himself a master of slaves, once wrote that cruelty to the enslaved diminishes the soul of the master. He urged kindness, moderation, even friendship. Yet his very words reveal the paradox. How could friendship exist where freedom did not? Even the most enlightened Roman could not escape the cognitive dissonance of a culture built on domination. And so the psychological cost was twofold. Enslaved people carried the scars of humiliation and lost identity. Free Romans carried the corrosive weight of fear, dependence, and moral compromise. It was a cost no census could count, but one that left its mark on the empire's conscience, if indeed it ever had one. Religion threaded through every seam of Roman life, and slavery was no exception. The cost of bondage was not merely physical or economic. It reached into the soul, shaping the prayers whispered at dawn, the sacrifices made at shrines, and the uneasy bargains struck with the gods. For the enslaved, religion was often the only space where dignity could survive. Some adopted the household gods of their masters, bowing to the Laras and Penates with the rest of the family. Yet even there, their role was precarious. They tended the flames of altars they did not own, spoke the invocations they had no power to command. Their offerings might rise with the smoke, but did the gods hear them as equals, or only as shadows beneath their master's petitions? Others clung fiercely to the gods of their homeland. A Thracian might whisper to horse spirits in the dark, long after his master had doused the lamps. A Syrian woman might keep a hidden amulet, carved with symbols of Astarte, tucked under her tunic as she worked. Such tokens were not simply acts of faith. They were anchors, reminders that they had once belonged somewhere, to someone, before Rome's markets had swallowed them whole. There was also the uneasy presence of foreign cults in Rome, many of which thrived among slaves. The cult of Isis, the rites of Mithras, the secretive worship of Cybele, all offered mysteries that spoke of liberation, rebirth, or hidden knowledge. To those in bondage, the promise of a new life, or a God who valued the humble, carried a special weight. One could not break chains with prayer alone, but one could, at least, imagine a world where chains did not matter. For the Romans themselves, slavery demanded constant ritual management. A master who mistreated his slaves too cruelly risked not only rebellion, but divine disfavor. The household spirits, it was believed, might turn against him if harmony was shattered. Even Jupiter, stern overseer of oaths, might look unkindly upon broken promises made to a servant. Thus, some masters performed gestures of ritual piety, offering sacrifices for the well-being of their household, which included their slaves. Yet these acts were less compassion than calculation, a way of placating gods as much as men. A master feared not only revolt, but cosmic judgment. At public festivals, too, the contradictions of slavery were laid bare. During Saturnalia, roles were briefly inverted. Slaves dined like masters, and masters served. It was play, yes, but also ritualized acknowledgement of a truth Rome rarely admitted. The gods could overturn human order at will, and those who ruled today might be humbled tomorrow. The spiritual cost of slavery was, in the end, the cost of distortion. Religion, meant to bind a community together, became a mirror of domination. The enslaved prayed for deliverance. The masters prayed for control. And the gods, silent and inscrutable, seemed to look on as both sides strained to find meaning in a system built on suffering. When Rome finally crumbled, its marble chipped, its forums fallen silent, the empire's great houses and sprawling estates dissolved into dust. Yet the shadow of slavery did not vanish with the Senate's last decrees. The system had etched itself into the bones of the world, leaving behind echoes that outlived the legions. The Roman reliance on enslaved labor had, for centuries, slowed the growth of technology. Why build machines when you had hands, cheap and endless? Why innovate when lives could be bought at market? When the empire collapsed, that habit of leaning on human bondage lingered in the lands Rome once ruled. Later ages, feudal lords, conquerors, colonizers, would, in their own ways, inherit Rome's logic, that power justified ownership, that domination was natural, that human beings could be measured like coin. The cost was not only borne by those enslaved, but by civilization itself. Every plow not invented, every tool not perfected, every art that might have blossomed but did not, these too were part of the ledger. Rome was rich, yes, dazzling in its monuments and spectacles, but its reliance on the suffering of millions drained away something far more precious: the possibility of a different future. And yet, within that darkness, fragments of resilience endured. In scraps of poetry written by enslaved hands, in whispered prayers that survived long enough to be retold, in quiet acts of defiance, a broken tool here, a delayed harvest there, the enslaved carved out their humanity against the weight of an empire. Their resistance, however small, mattered. It meant that Rome's cruelty was never total, never unopposed. As centuries rolled on, later societies looked back at Rome with awe and unease. The grandeur of its aqueducts and arches dazzled, but always, beneath the stone, ran the silent current of exploitation. Philosophers, churchmen, and lawmakers wrestled with the paradox: how could a civilization so advanced be built upon something so brutal? Some justified it. Others condemned it. The debate, in different forms, still lingers today. In the end, the true cost of Roman slavery cannot be tallied in denarii or estates. It lies in the lost lives, the silenced voices, the futures unmade. Rome bought itself centuries of power, yes, but at a price that even its glory could not hide. The streets of Rome are silent now. The cries of the slave markets have long since vanished, carried away on the same winds that once rattled the legion's banners. The marble columns, cracked and weathered, stand like ghosts of an empire that believed itself eternal. And yet, beneath their shadows, one can almost hear it still: the murmur of footsteps not chosen, the quiet rustle of chains, the soft breath of those who dreamed of freedom under the same stars that crowned the emperors. History often remembers Rome for its grandeur, the arches, the games, the endless reach of its legions. But just beyond that brilliance lies the true heartbeat of the empire, the millions who were bought, sold, and forgotten. Their cost was not written in ledgers alone, but in songs never sung, in children never born, in hopes that dissolved like morning mist. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, think of them not as nameless shadows in the empire's story, but as people who laughed, who wept, who loved, who waited. They were the foundation beneath the marble, the voices beneath the roar. And though Rome has crumbled, their presence lingers, in silence, in memory, in the gentle truth that no empire, however mighty, can ever truly erase the lives it once tried to own. So rest now. The empire is gone.